you may find yourself, if this is the first sermon you've heard on Matthew 24, we've had two before this, and it's taken two sermons to cover verses 1, 2, and 3. And those were critically important because what we wanted to look at in those first two sermons is to lay a bedrock and a foundation for how we're going to interpret some of the more ambiguous and cryptic phrases in Matthew 24. All you got to do is turn to it and start breezing through the chapter, and you're going to see, wow, there's a lot of strange, cryptic, far out sounding stuff in there. So what we did first was we laid a solid foundation by finding out the things that are concrete, objective, unambiguous ideas of time frames and so forth. And we laid the foundation from those things, and now we're going to interpret some of the more ambiguous, weird, scary sounding stuff, already having decided what the chapter is saying in those first couple of sermons. We're going to begin already understanding that all of the things that we're about to talk about, if you jump ahead to verse 34, Matthew 24:34, it already has told us all of these things will happen to this generation. That's our bedrock, that's our foundation. Everything that's going to happen is going to fall on this generation. So all the things we're going to read about are going to fall on that first century disciples' age when Jesus was there with His disciples. He is saying, you guys are going to be the ones to see all of this happen. That's important to us because the majority of interpreters of Matthew 24 talk about the rapture, the great tribulation that's still ahead, that's still coming, 1,000-year reign of Christ, and they get all of that interpretation from Matthew 24. But hopefully we've laid a bedrock foundation to recognize, nope, that was going to happen to those people in their day before they die. They're going to see all this stuff happen. So we're in our third sermon today. Go ahead and turn to Matthew 24 and verse 3. The title of today's sermon is The Signs of the End of the Age. The signs of the end of the age. But what's important is when we look at what Matthew says here, in both Mark's account and Luke's account, the disciples make one simple statement. The disciples say, when is the end going to happen? That's going to be in Mark 13, verse 4, Luke 21 and verse 7. When is all this going to happen? Very simple statement. Matthew blesses us by taking the one simple statement about when is the temple going to be destroyed. When are all the rocks not going to be left one on top of another? When is that going to happen? But Matthew breaks that into two contexts, I guess I could say. Matthew breaks it into two pieces. Both pieces are describing the destruction of Jerusalem, but they describe it from a different perspective. That's called a recapitulation. Very important that we recognize Matthew is going to give us two descriptions of one event, the destruction of the temple. Let's go ahead and look at what they say in Matthew. He breaks it into two pieces here. Matthew 24:3. What will be the sign of, here's the two events, your coming and the end of the age? But we know from Mark and Luke that those are the same event, the destruction of the temple. So what he is doing is he is giving two perspectives on the same event. The first perspective is Jesus as high priest. That's going to be the verses we look at today, verses 4 through 14. Jesus as high priest means he is the new high priest. He has entered the true Holy of Holies, the heavenly Holy of Holies, a place that's not made with hands. Therefore, because a new high priest has entered the actual Holy of Holies in heaven in the presence of God, the man-made Holy of Holies must be destroyed. Very important, and that was last week's sermon. So the destruction of the temple in the context of Jesus as the new high priest. But then Matthew is going to double back and he's going to give us another perspective on the destruction of the temple. But he's going to allude to Daniel this time. And that's the first part of what he says. When is going to be the sign of your coming? Your coming is going to be the second part of Matthew, verses 15 and on through the end of chapter 24. And your coming is the little catchphrase for the coming of the Son of Man, which was announced in Daniel chapters 2 through 7. Matthew is going to record for us the events that Daniel chapter 2 through 7. I saw one like a son of man coming on the clouds to the right hand of the Ancient of Days. That is the Son of Man coming. So both of those are two perspectives of one and the same event. We call that a recapitulation. That's a very good word to know. So let me give you a definition for it. A recapitulation is to give more than one account of the same event. It's good for you to have that word in your repertoire because that is a biblical technique. It's throughout the Bible. It happens in the book of Daniel. There are 3 or 4 accounts of the same event. One account is Nebuchadnezzar sees the big, huge statue, and it's got 4 different parts, and a rock comes and breaks apart the statue. Later on in Daniel, you see this big, tall tree. Big, tall tree gets cut down. That's another way of saying the same thing. Later on in Daniel will see 4 big beasts. I forget what they were, but 4 beasts. Those 4 beasts are 4 different nations, and they get destroyed. So multiple versions of one and the same event in Daniel. The best example of recapitulation is the 4 Gospels. The 4 Gospels are 4 different perspectives on the same event. Another idea of recapitulation, Revelation. In Revelation, you've got 7 seals. After 7 seals, you've got 7 trumpets. After 7 trumpets, you've got 7 bowls. All of those are recapitulation, a retelling of the same story from a different perspective. That's a biblical technique, and it's valuable that we catch it. Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Genesis chapter 1 is the story of creation. Genesis chapter 2, a retelling of the story of creation, but this time focusing on Adam and Eve. Recapitulation. It's important that we know that that's in there. So, let me give you an example. We've talked a lot about that in the first century when they wrote their manuscripts, they didn't have any kind of formatting. There was no bold, there was no italics, there was no punctuation, no exclamation point. There were no paragraphs, no paragraph breaks, just one super long run-on sentence. So we write more scientifically, we write chronologically, we write completely differently today than they did then. What they did then is they put the clues inside of the text. One of the main clues they used within the text was repetition. So that you could follow a thought, since there was no paragraph breaks, instead of paragraph breaks, they used repetition. They kept repeating the same phrase. So you would recognize, oh, okay, this is about that. Then there's usually a transition verse and then a bunch of repetitions of a new phrase. And now you know, oh, he switched to this other idea. That is what happens in Matthew chapter 24. I want to show it to you. I would put squares around these repetitious words so that you can tell the difference. In Matthew verses 4 through 14, he's going to answer the second question, when will be the end of the age? And the clue that he gives us over and over is the phrase, the end, the end, the end. That lets us know he's focusing on that particular aspect. So let me show them to you. 24 and verse 6, this must take place, but the end is not yet. All these are but the beginning of the birth pangs. 24 and verse 8, 24 and verse 13. The one who endures to the end, put a square around the end, will be saved. 24:14, as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. There's your repetitions. So you know that that whole section is dedicated to the signs of the end of the age. That'll be the section we exposit today. But let me show you the next section. Verse 15, this will be next week's section. Verse 15 is a transition verse, and he leads them, look at 24 and verse 15, the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by the prophet Daniel. That is your clue. That is your paragraph break, that now we're moving to the stuff that Daniel warned us about. And what Daniel told us was the coming of the Son of Man. That's your transition verse. That's your clue. There's your paragraph break. And he goes, after that, you'll see repetition. 24 and verse 27, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Verse 24 and 30. Verse 24 and chapter 24 and 30. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. 24 and 30, B. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. 24 and 33. See all these things, you know that He, the Son of Man, is very near. 24 and 34. This generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Verse 34, you see all the repetitions, and verse 34 is what drives it home for us. And all of the stuff that I've been talking about, the end of the age, the coming of the Son of Man, this generation will not pass away until all the stuff has happened. So as we read about stars falling out of the sky and moons turning dark and blood and great tribulation and persecution coming upon people, you should be able to read that very relaxed and go, oh, interesting, because that happened a long time ago. You shouldn't read Matthew 24 and be afraid that, oh no, that's still coming in the future. And verse 34 is your linchpin to hold all of this together. Matthew has created two sections of chapter 24. And actually, the second section, the coming of the Son of Man, breaks into two sections as well, but we'll look at that next week. So let's just look at verses 4 through 14. Signs of the end of the age. The end of the age meaning the end of the temple age, the end of the high priest age, where the high priest goes into the man-made Holy of Holies once a year. It's the end of that age because the new high priest, Jesus Christ, has come and He has entered into the true Holy of Holies, the true heavenly places, into the presence of God. Therefore, we no longer need the copy and the shadow of those true heavenly things. So the end of the age is the end of that high priest age, the end of the temple, the end of the man-made Holy of Holies, because we have a new priest, a new high priest that's entered the true heavenly Holy of Holies. The temple needs to be destroyed. Here are the signs to watch for, he says. Verse 4, false messiahs. Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, because many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many people astray. It might sound kind of strange to us because from our perspective, there is only one Christ. Who in the world, if some guy was to show up out here on the street corner with a sign saying, I am Jesus, the end is near, none of us would buy that. So this seems odd. Who would buy somebody showing up saying, I'm Jesus, back from the dead? Who would buy that? And I want to give you some background to what that first century was like, because that actually was a very common occurrence. When powerful people died, when famous people died, it was very common, A, for people to be afraid of them coming back from the dead, and B, for other imposters to find a nook or a hole that they can fill and take over where that guy left. Very common. I want to give you some of that history of what we saw happen between the death and resurrection of Christ and the destruction of the temple. So from 30 A.D., the death and resurrection, to 70 A.D., the destruction of the temple, a 40-year period of time. What things happened in that 40-year period of time? First of all, notice he's telling them, see that no one leads you astray. Put a square around you. Who's he talking to? His disciples. You guys better be aware this is going to happen in your time. Make sure that you don't get misled. Let me read you what Josephus says about some of the false messiahs that showed up. Just a couple quotes. Josephus in his Antiquities, book number 18, contains all of these examples. I'll just give you a couple. So there was a gathering together in the Samaritan villages, a massive rebellion because a false Messiah showed up there, told them all, follow me to the mountain where they all worshiped, because Moses has left a bunch of important remnants and we're going to go discover all the stuff that Moses led for us. We're going to find out that Pontius Pilate did not like them doing that. So he bade them get together upon Mount Gerizim, the holy mountain, to see the sacred vessels that Moses had put there. And a great multitude desired to go up to the mountain, but Pilate prevented them, and he ordered them to be slain. Don't believe these false messiahs, because those movements end up getting slaughtered. Don't buy into it. A second one in 44 AD, so this is almost 15 years after the resurrection, another person came claiming to be the Messiah, and he took a whole load of people and took them back down to Jericho to the Jordan. And at the Jericho and Jordan, I'm sorry, I put both those together. I'm not sure if they go together. He took them to the Jordan River anyway. And he said that he was going to part the Jordan the same way that they did in the exiles. Look at what happened to that group. Josephus' Antiquities, book number 20. It came to pass while Fatus was the procurator of Judea that certain charlatan, whose name was Theudius, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them that he was a prophet and that he would divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it. Many were deluded by his words. However, Fatus sent a troop of horsemen out against them. They slew many of them and took many of them alive. They also took Theudius alive. They cut off his head and they carried it to Jerusalem. There's a lot more examples of false messiahs showing up, misleading people. Let me give you another feel for what it was like back then. You may remember Herod Antipas was one of the tetrarchs up in Galilee. He's the one that executed John the Baptist, had his head cut off. But when he heard about Jesus, do you remember Herod Antipas got afraid when he heard about Jesus because he was thinking that Jesus was John the Baptist come back from the dead. It gives us a feel for what that first century was like. Oh no, this is him come back from the dead. Another big one, which is what the book of Revelation deals with, Nero. Nero commits suicide, 68 AD. But after Nero committed suicide, Josephus tells us, and Tacitus, Roman historians tell us, there were several false Neros that appeared and started trying to lead people. One of the most famous ones appeared in Parthia. And the book of Revelation, it says it looked like he had been slain, but he came back again. That was this idea of Nero who had committed suicide, but there's another guy claiming to be Nero in Parthia, and everybody was waiting for him to come back. So superstitious type stuff, but valuable for us to know. After Nero, several emperors later, Domitian. Domitian was the emperor in 96 AD when John wrote the book of Revelation. Domitian was afraid of the second coming of Christ. Domitian the emperor, one of the Roman historians lets us know, he became so afraid at this coming of Christ that he ordered that all of Jesus' descendants be rounded up and brought to him for execution. At the time, it was grandchildren of Jude, Jesus' brother, who were rounded up and brought to Domitian. And when Domitian saw them, they were bent over and broken and had calloused hands. They were humble people that were making a meager living by farming. And they told Domitian, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Jesus' kingdom is of a spiritual realm. And Domitian was satisfied with that and didn't kill them. Beautiful how the story of Jesus touches all of the emperors in the Roman Empire. You cannot read Roman history without seeing Jesus show up somewhere in there. Now we might think, really, there's some good examples there, but could people really be led astray by a false Messiah? Well, let's come to our own time. Does anybody remember Waco, Texas? David Koresh, the Branch Davidians, how many hundreds of people believed? He taught them the book of Revelation, and from Revelation convinced them that he was Jesus Christ. Who in the world would believe that? Well, hundreds of people believed it. We got another guy that took people, I think, to Venezuela. They drank some Kool-Aid. Jim Jones. Jonestown, wasn't it? Jonestown, taking a bunch of seemingly intelligent people to, was it Venezuela or Guyana? Hundreds of people believing he was the Messiah. So maybe we can relate a little better than we think. There's another guy, Hunka Burnin' Love. Elvis. Aren't there some people that think Elvis has been spotted? So we can kind of relate to how this whole thing about, hey guys, there's a Messiah. He's come back. Let's go out and I hear they saw Vegas I hear they saw Elvis in Vegas. He's doing a show every Thursday night, guys. Let's go see him. So maybe we can relate a little bit to that. The second sign, wars and rumors of wars. Verse 6, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. This must take place, but the end, the destruction of the temple, is not here yet. Matthew does a really good job of creating anticipation. What do we call that? Keeping you on pins and needles. Good storyteller. The end is not yet. Wars and rumors of wars. Let me tell you some stuff that happened between the resurrection and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Civil wars were breaking out rampantly in Jerusalem. Jerusalem becomes a hotbed. They call it a powder keg, ready to explode. Everything was going wrong after the resurrection. Jesus has gone back to heaven. Jerusalem starts to disintegrate. The Jews divide into many factions. The Zealots, the Sicarii, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees gang up and try to gain power in Jerusalem. There are civil wars all throughout Jerusalem. Anarchy, Jews fighting Jews. One quick little quote from a blog post. There were 3 factions that fought amongst themselves. There was no moral order, just daily street fighting. It's unfortunate that as believers, most of our theology stops at the resurrection. Jesus resurrected, and that is the climax. But we're not really familiar with anything that happens after the resurrection. And really, the destruction of the temple 40 years later is a major aspect of theology for us. We're just not that familiar with it. So there is civil unrest in Judea. The Zealots burned up all the food supplies in order to gain advantage. People began turning to cannibalism, and this is well before the Romans come in to destroy everything. Here are some names. I don't know them, but John of Gishgala and his band of bandits controlled the central part of the city. Another man named Simon got control of the city walls, and they warred between themselves. Another man named Eleazar took his group, and they gained control of the temple. The temple was being blasphemed. There was bloodshed in the temple. The temple was a site of a massive massacre and no longer the holy site that it had been in the past. At some point, the zealots overcome those that had taken over the temple. The zealots enter into the temple. They slaughter all of the people in the Temple Mount. There's massive bloodshed happening there. And then the scribes and the Pharisees pull together and they form a makeshift government called the Judean Provisional Government. The Judean Provisional Government, they went into the temple. They attacked the zealots. They beat the zealots. And now the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees have dominance over the temple. This is an important concept because Jesus tells the Sadducees when they're giving him the false trial, condemning him to death, Jesus said, from now on, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. Very quickly, what he's saying there is those are words of judgment and wrath. You guys, when you kill me, you're going to witness the unraveling of Jerusalem. And when that happens, you're going to know that I was who I said I was. And this is all recorded for us in history. After all this bloodshed is happening, a mixture then of the other neighboring nations get wind that Jerusalem is falling apart. And nations are always looking forward to expanding their territory. So other nations down in the south, the Idumeans, rose up and they decided, hey, Jerusalem is vulnerable. Let's go take our own stab at it. A sect of Romans that were in the area, they decide, hey, Jerusalem is vulnerable. They come and they take Jerusalem and try to conquer it. They're not successful at that time. Tens of thousands of people are murdered. Rome begins coming in to squelter what's happening, but Roman armies first start in Galilee, up north. They conquer Galilee, which is when Josephus, one of the military leaders in Galilee, escapes to Jerusalem. The other military men in Galilee also see the Romans coming, so they escape to Jerusalem, but they want power. So now they fight that Judean provincial government of Sadducees and Pharisees. Idumeans, Romans, and Galileans all come, and Jerusalem is being destroyed from within, and Rome hasn't even arrived yet. Fascinating history. Sorry, guys. At that same time, as we get closer to 70 AD, when the destruction is going to come on Jerusalem, all kinds of civil wars begin breaking out in Rome against Nero, the current emperor. The governor of Spain revolts against Rome and comes and tries to capture Nero. The Roman legions from Africa and from Egypt revolt, and they all come against Nero in Rome. Nero must have gone to some crazy place in his head, because Nero decides this would be a great time to set Rome on fire. Remember the story? He plays his fiddle while Rome burns. Nero sets part of Rome on fire for some ridiculous thing. This isn't it, but it's almost like Nero said, hey, that'd be a good place to put a swimming pool. Let's burn all that stuff so I can have a pool. It was something like that. Not exactly. But he decides he wants a garden. He decides he wants what do we call that? Eminent domain? Government comes in and says, we think we like your house. We think we're just going to take it over. So Nero burns a big part of Rome. Rome is burning. And then he blames it on the Christians. Do you know that part of history? Nero blames the burning of Rome on Christians. There's a huge persecution of the Christians. They're burned alive. They're fed to dogs and lions in the Colosseum. Horrible. The whole world is in unrest. Wars and rumors of wars. Nero commits suicide. What did I say, 68 AD? Nero commits suicide. What happens next? When there's a vacuum, that's a very dangerous time for a nation. There's a vacuum in Rome. Somebody rises up, takes over the position, becomes an emperor. He's killed because he doesn't know how to stop the civil wars. A second man rises up, becomes emperor. They kill him because he can't stop the civil wars. A third man, a fourth man. Some of you may be aware that in AD 69, there's something called the Year of the Four Emperors in Rome. The Year of the Four Emperors. There was so much unrest that not a single emperor could survive. They were being killed. That happens 1 year before the destruction of Jerusalem. Vespasian becomes the fourth emperor in Rome, and Vespasian is the one that goes over and starts to attack Jerusalem. 69. Actually, the attack started at 67 AD, 68, 69, 70 AD. It's finally destroyed. So absolute, complete unrest. Number 3, what are other signs? Well, they're going to deliver you. Who's he talking to? The disciples. You guys are going to be killed. That comes next. Let's look at it. Verse 9. Then they will deliver you, put a square around that, up to tribulations. And they're going to put you to death. And you are going to be hated by all the nations for my name's sake. Well, that shouldn't be surprising. That's not a scary end-time tribulation that we should all be terrified of. That is already a recapitulation of what Jesus already explained to his disciples. The problem is, by the time we get to Matthew chapter 24, we've already forgotten Matthew chapter 10. So let's just go back to Matthew 10 and see tribulation, persecution, flogging, death, crucifixion. Jesus already told them all that. Matthew chapter 10, verse 34. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Pop back up to verse 17, chapter 10 and verse 17. Beware of men, because they will deliver you over to courts, and they will flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness for them and the Gentiles. Notice, if you're going to be dragged before governors and before kings, that means you're going to be out in other nations, in other worlds. Other countries are going to hear your message. Verse 21, brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise up against their parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end, there it is, the end of the age, the destruction of Jerusalem, will be saved. Verse 23, and when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. There is both of our texts that we looked at in verse 3, the end of the age and the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus already told them the end of the age and the coming of the Son of Man, right there in our verses. You will not finish evangelizing Israel before all of this happens. Are you glad to know that? There are a lot of people that want to scare you to death and say that all of this stuff is in your future. You should be terrified. You better hope that you get raptured. Well, obviously, we've got too many objective, concrete, unambiguous clues that we know, nope, all of this already happened in the first century to the people that Jesus was talking about. Fourth sign, love will grow cold. Verse 12, And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will go cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. There's a recapitulation. Verse 13 here, enduring to the end, he just repeated what we read in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 22. Whoever endures to the end will be saved. Here it is, 14 chapters later. Whoever endures to the end will be saved. That kind of repetition, that kind of intratextual clue is a real technique that the biblical authors used to connect ideas and to keep ideas in the same thought. The one who endures to the end. This first section, verses 4 through 14, have repeated several of the phrases that, if we don't forget what we've already studied, are phrases that Jesus has already told his disciples. And we come to verse 14. Number 5, the gospel will go to the whole world, and then the end will come. This is a big one. Many people will say, yeah, that didn't happen in the first century. By the destruction of the temple in AD 70, that didn't happen. Well, if we don't forget what we've already read, you come to a different conclusion. Did the Gospels reach the whole world before the destruction of the temple? Well, let's remember that even in Jesus' own ministry, Jesus started out in Galilee, but by the time of the end of his 3-year ministry, we know that Jesus and his disciples already went way out to Tyre and Sidon in Phoenicia, which is all the way to the sea. From the river to the sea. Jesus already evangelized all the way to the sea. After that, the transfiguration happens at the farthest northernmost part of Israel, Caesarea Philippi, as far north as he could go. Come back, and then they cross over on his way to Jerusalem. They cross over the Jordan, and they go out into what's called the Golan Heights today. Back then it was called the Decapolis. So he went as far east as he could into Gentile territory. Then he makes his way down to Jericho, comes back into Jerusalem. So just Jesus and his disciples covered a lot of ground. Let me give you some biblical texts that even are more convincing than that. Romans chapter 10, Paul is the one that took the gospel even further, didn't he? He took the gospel to the Gentiles. So let's look Romans chapter 10 and verse 17. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing comes through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, because their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. A little bit later in Romans chapter 16, verse 25, he makes the same thing known again. Verse 25, the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, but it has now been disclosed, and through the prophetic writings it has been made known to all the nations. Over in Colossians chapter 1 verses 5 and 6, of this you have heard before in the word of truth, the gospel, which has come to you, as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing. From the first century disciples' perspective, the gospel had gone out into the whole world. I believe Paul is killed in Rome, I want to say in the 60s, 64, 65, 66. Don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure it's before the destruction of the temple. Paul dies. Yeah, I don't know if I can quote that exactly. You might look that up on Google. When did Paul die? Because Paul is saying in his lifetime, every nation under heaven The ends of the earth have heard the gospel. All right, guys, let's put a pin right there. That's verse 14, and that's the end of describing the destruction of the temple in terms of the end of the age. The end of that high priest, Holy of Holy age, where the Holy of Holies was only on earth and was man-made. It's the end of that age, the destruction of the temple, because now our high priest has gone up into the true Holy of Holies that is not made with hands, into the heavenly places. And as we saw last week's sermon, as a result of going into the heavenly places, Jesus has poured out heavenly blessings on the church. He said after the destruction of the temple, He revealed to us in Ezekiel. Ezekiel was mourning because God gave him a vision of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel mourned, how are we going to find God? Where is God's presence going to be? And God consoles him and says, Ezekiel, don't worry about this, because when you see the righteous people that come out of the destruction of Jerusalem, when you see the church, when you see the holy, blameless people that come out of that, then you will understand that I did not destroy Jerusalem without cause. What he's saying is, I had to get rid of those man-made high priests. I had to get rid of that man-made Holy of Holies. My presence left the temple because you guys turned the temple into a den of thieves and robbers. So it took the true high priest to go into heaven. And now that He is there, He has poured out heavenly blessings on us. And we looked at Ephesians chapters 1, 2, and 3. You guys have been adopted. You guys have been taken from death into life. You have received life as a result of your new high priest. All the spiritual blessings, you guys are the heir of all of the biblical promises. That's why it was necessary for the high priest to get into heavenly places, and the temple had to be destroyed. That is the first characterization that Matthew gives of the destruction of the temple. We'll put a pin there and we'll start in verse 15 next week. The next characterization of the destruction of the temple is the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 2 through 7. Someone who looked like a son of man that went on the clouds and sat down at the right hand of the Ancient of Days. What does that have to do with the destruction of the temple? Well, we'll learn next week.